but
That
more
sounds good. More intimate though.
yeah, exactly. More time for us to
Yeah.
pick up your wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you? How was
I'm good.
this morning? You went to, you had a,
Yes. Yeah, I had a court. So right now, because of COVID, we're still having virtual appearances for the most part for immigration court. So yeah, so I had that into it went on until like early afternoon. So around like 12:30, I think is when I was able to log off. But it went well. It was just an initial hearing, so it's fine. Sorry?
I have some questions about immigration court.
yeah, I think
Oh, you do? Okay.
yeah. Could you tell us, well, how about, I have my own question, but what's your question?
You know how long it takes for a person to get like their status as an immigration court?
Yes, that's such an important question. And it's so important because it depends on many factors. So usually when people, one of their primary questions is like, oh, how can I get status? So as immigration attorneys, we have to look at various things. So one of the first things is, how did you come here? So for example, some people, they were given, they were able to come with a tourist visa, right? And then they overstayed the visa, they just stayed. So they have a different process by which they could potentially be on a path to getting status, especially if they end up marrying someone that has lawful status. So if, like, let's say they ended up overstaying the visa, they're here for many years, they fall in love or not, but somehow they get married to someone that's a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident, then they would have to do a process that's called petitioning. They will have to get a specific pardon or waiver because they overstayed their visa. So it's a longer process. If there's some people that came here without any status, right? Like they got here and they didn't have any contact with immigration. They're here undocumented. Their path to getting lawful status is a bit more difficult, more complicated. And it also depends if they're in removal, what they call removal proceedings. So if there's someone that got arrested by ICE, by immigration enforcement, and then they're in deportation proceedings, those are usually the clients I work with, then they have limited options so that they can try to get here and stay here and possibly get in a path to lawful status. And then we have like kids that were raised here, right? That are like what people consider DACA. They also have a different path because of DACA, especially if they do, I'm sorry, I don't want to get too technical, but their journey is a little bit different depending on whether they ever got something called advanced parole. Like if they ever were able to return to their country with permission from the US and then came back, then they are going to be similar to someone that came and overstayed their visa. And let's say if they get married to a US citizen. So all that to say is that it's a very complicated question, and an immigration attorney has to ask you a bunch of questions to try to understand how you came here, what, why you don't have status right now. And from that, they can let you know whether there is a path for you to get lawful status. Sometimes the advice is that right now there's not, or that it's extremely difficult. And those are usually the most heartbreaking cases. But not everybody, unfortunately, because of our immigration system, the way it's set up, not everybody has a path to get lawful status, even though they've been here. So yeah, so it's a really good question that's usually what we start asking when we have clients.
What if it's somebody that was born here as a child?
Mm-hmm.
Child, and they eventually they stayed until they're like 21 and now
Mm-hmm.
for status.
Right. So that might be someone that falls under what they call DACA, even though DACA right now is, so that's like deferred action for childhood arrivals. So DACA right now, they're not accepting applications because of certain actions that the last administration took. But essentially, I would ask, one of the questions I would ask that person is, have you ever gotten a parole, what they call advanced parole? Have you ever gotten permission from the US government to travel back outside of the US and come back? Because that person would need what we call an admission. There would need to be something saying like they came in at some point with interaction with immigration officials and then they were admitted to this country to be able to have a path to citizenship. But then there's other questions. It's very complicated because then I will also ask that person, have they ever been a victim of a crime here? There's something called U visa. There's other forms of relief, depending if they ever were a victim of crime and they reported that. Also, do they have parents that have status? Were they ever abused by other parents? So there's a lot of questions. There's different forms of relief. I would say that person definitely should, if they can, speak to an immigration attorney to see if there is a path for them. They would ask them in a consultation, they will ask them many questions to try to help them figure out if they do have a path. So yeah, it's a very important question, and often we need a lot of information, unfortunately, to give like more concrete definition answer.
This kind of ties into my first question, and I'm sorry that's a super awkward setup, but it's
no, you're fine.
way, right? Just kind of like,
Sorry?
It's kind of the Lehman way, what we're doing.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
And you're an alum, so you know.
Yes.
But my first question was kind of a weird one. It's tied to Lehman. Could you tell us about your very first day at Lehman, and if you happen to remember, and then your last day at Lehman, whether that was graduation or the last day of classes? And
oh wow, yeah.
So like we're going back, and I was looking at your LinkedIn, and for I hope when you leave this class, you get into the habit of researching people briefly on LinkedIn. And I noticed your thesis, your senior's thesis at Lehman was gender inequality beyond the golden statue, examining on-screen portrayals of female characters in Best Picture nominated films, 2011 to 2013. So I have two questions for you. Basically, your time at Lehman, if you could give us an overview of that, and then just kind of greedily thinking about the Oscars and what recently happened. Could you tell us about your thesis?
Yes. Those are all great questions. Okay, so my first day at Lehman, I don't remember the exact first day. I do remember how I felt like starting at Lehman College. Because I went straight from high school to college. And I think I remember sentiments of feeling overwhelmed. I didn't know like what to expect from college. There, in high school, at least my senior class, they tried to give us an idea of what college would look like, but obviously once you get there, it's very different. And so I remember feeling extremely overwhelmed. And one of the most difficult challenges I had in the beginning was just like learning how to pace myself and my work. Because obviously, in high school, at least in my high school, it was very much like, you have this assignment due tomorrow, or like 2 days from now, and this is what you should be doing on this day. There was a lot of instructions. And then of course, when I went to college, it was just like, here is a preview of the entire semester, and these are when assignments are going to be due. And I didn't know, like, I remember panicking, like, oh, when should I be starting this? Like, how do I really try to be organized and plan my semester so then last minute I'm not overwhelmed with all my classes? And I mean, that's something I realized that this is something about myself. I tend to procrastinate. And so that's something I really had to work on. And I felt overwhelmed about in the beginning. I also felt like, oh, this is going to be difficult. Like, how I'm going to find community here. In high school, I had a very close-knit group of friends. And I was lucky in that one of my best friends came to Lehman, but we ended up having very different classes. So I wasn't in all, we didn't have, I don't think we had one class in common our first year. It was probably until we were juniors that we started sharing classes. So I felt a little bit lonely, and I'm not, I felt awkward. Like, do you just approach people? How do you make friends? And so so during the beginning of like my experience at Lehman, it was very difficult, isolating in a way. And it took time. I think it was like probably spring semester of my first year, and then definitely going towards my second year of college, that I started to feel more comfortable and find community. And the way I did that I found community, is just that I started joining student groups. While I was at Lehman College, I was part of at the time, I don't know if they have this anymore, but it was called the Dream Team. So it was a group specifically in support of undocumented students. And this was at the time when there was a lot of conversations around like something called the Dream Act. There was a lot of political conversations about students and kids that were raised here basically, and now were at risk of deportation or just felt like they were in limbo. So I joined that group. We organized events, and then I met other student groups that way. I also joined the college newspaper at the time, the Meridian, and later on became editor-in-chief of that. So I tried to like get really involved with student life, and that helped me find community, and I felt less lonely. So once I approached, you know, my senior year, and especially the last day, like once we had the graduation, I felt the exact opposite. I felt like I was leaving with community. I felt that I was able to establish good relationships with professors. So I felt a bit empowered. Like I felt like whatever is the next step, I'm gonna be okay. Even though at that stage I still had no idea. Like I didn't have a job secure or anything like that. I did a double major in sociology and business administration. So I was trying to figure out, at that point I already knew I wanted to go to law school, but I knew that I didn't want to go right away. So I was trying to figure out like what would be my first job post college. So that's how I felt towards the end of Lehman. And then as to the question about the Oscars and my thesis, yeah, I was like literally watching the Oscars from the beginning and was super shocked when that big event happened. But I'm a fan of movies. So I love movies. I love literature about movies. I love people that analyze, criticize movies. And so I knew that when I had to do my senior thesis, I wanted it to be focused around film. And then something that I was very passionate about was just about representation or lack of representation on film. So I was focused on women, and I think I also highlighted the lack of representation of like Latinx women, Black women on screen as well. And it was interesting, like basically for my thesis, I got to watch a bunch of movies, Oscar nominated films. And then I had developed a methodology of trying to calculate how much appearances they had on screen. So I found it to be a really fun thesis. And I forgot why I had to do a thesis. I think it was for my major or the honors program. But if any of you end up having to do a thesis or you choose to do a thesis, I would definitely say like try to do something that you're interested in, right? Because you're gonna have to be investing so much time. And then just connect it to, obviously it'll be something related maybe to your major or something you're studying, but try to like focus on something you're passionate about, because it makes it much more enjoyable and also just more interesting. So that was my experiences with the senior thesis writing.
And I believe you interned at Latino Justice after Lehman?
Yes, because I entered that Latino Justice when I was in law school. So the way law school works is once you're in law school is 3 years for the most part. Some people, there are part-time programs for people that choose, that just don't have the means to go to law school full time. So I had made the choice. I knew that financially I couldn't afford, graduating from Lehman and then going straight to law school. Even though I was lucky, I didn't graduate with debt. I knew that I wanted to help out my family. Like I needed to work. So I took 2 years off just working at a nonprofit in the Bronx. And then while I was working at the nonprofit, I worked on my application for law school, took the LSAT, which is the test you need to get admitted into law school. And so in law school, it's 3 years, unless, like I said, you're in a part-time program and you're working while you're working while you're pursuing law school, then sometimes those could be 4-year programs. There are some unique programs in the US where maybe you have to go through law school for 2 years and then in your last year, you're just placed at an organization. I think New York State has a program like that. But yeah, for the 3 years, usually the expectation is that each summer of your law school year, you do an internship. So I did internships my first year summer and the second year summer. And then I wanted additional experience. So I did an internship during law school. So what I did is, especially the second year, the first year you usually have mandatory courses you have to take. And then your second year, you start taking electives, whatever. If you're drawn to a particular area, then you start taking classes around that. So I made my schedule work so that I could do my externship. They call them externships, and do classes. So that's when I did Latino Justice.
Would you want to talk about working for that organization?
Yeah. So Latino Justice is really dope. They're a civil rights organization that particularly advocates and protects the interest of the Latinx community, Latinos, Latinas. And so they are focused on bringing forward like constitutional challenges, bringing forward cases, litigation, cases where if they see issues happening across communities, then they're usually at the forefront of trying to bring those suits to court. So some of the work they've done is voting rights litigation. So in certain districts, so some of the research I did, there were certain districts in New York State, more so outside of New York City, where there were a large portion of Puerto Rican voters, registered voters, and communities that were largely Spanish speaking. So they're supposed to receive voter registration information in Spanish. The day of voting, they should have poster flyers in Spanish, especially because you have to meet a certain threshold, what they did. And we found that certain counties and communities outside of New York City were not complying with that. So some of the work I did was just more fact information gathering to try to give them the substantive information they needed to then prepare for a lawsuit. So they've done lawsuits like that. I also worked with another intern on some interesting cases regarding kind of mass discrimination. This was happening more, it's still happening, but was happening more so than in Long Island. A lot of kids from Central America were being grouped into, so the Department of Homeland Security was arresting Central American youth in Long Island and charging them for deportation. Usually these were kids that have been here since a very young age, their parents brought them, and they were lumping them in, there's this category in which they were assuming that they were like associated with MS-13, with gangs. And a lot of the arrests that were happening were baseless. They were just discriminatory. A lot of the arrests were happening because of specifically what communities in Long Island these kids lived in. And it would be like silly stuff, just like, oh, this person goes to this school and this school has a big demographic of MS-13. He was seen walking outside, so we're charging him with being as part of the MS-13 and like gang activities. And so they were finding that when these cases were reaching court, there was no, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, didn't really have evidence to support this. It was more these very discriminatory assumptions of who these kids were and what communities they came from. So Latino Justice did a lot of work, litigation around that, and saying like, you can't just arrest these kids and assume they're gang members because they're from Central America and because they live in these parts of Long Island. So they do really interesting litigation. So constitutional challenges. I also worked on a case. I was researching for a potential case. I don't know if they ended up bringing it, but basically in a part of Georgia, they were not issuing driver license to certain people that came from Puerto Rico, but were living now in New York, let's say, or at that point they were living in Georgia. And so I think Georgia, had to be some education about, Puerto Ricans are US citizens. So challenges like that. And they continue to do really amazing work. So as an intern there, I got to just get a better understanding of what, how they decide what kind of cases they want to focus on and what issues they want to target. So it was a really great experience.
So we have a document going around where people can type in questions. And
okay, cool.
One question which I always love to hear the response to is, what is a piece of advice you know now that you wish you had learned during Lehman?
That's a really good one. I want to be thoughtful about this. So I would say one thing is, especially, so I went to the University of Pennsylvania Law School, which is a private institution. They're like an Ivy League school. And so going there, I would say, and this is, I would say for most law school, especially in a certain ranking, a lot of the students there come from generations filled with, their parents were attorneys, their grandparents were attorneys. And so it was a very small population of students that came that were educated in, in public institutions such as Lehman College. And so I would say, I wish I could go back to myself in Lehman and like remind myself, because I think I went to law school with a lot of insecurities, just to remind myself that we have the right to take up space. We're not receiving, the education we receive at Lehman is strong. You have, all the courses that you're taking is going to inform kind of the career the career path you want to take. I would say also that find value in the fact that you go to a public institution and that you are educated with such a diverse student body, because going to law school, it was the exact opposite experience for me. I would say predominantly, it was not diverse. And like I said, there was usually students that come from families that are second, now they're going to be the second, third generation attorney. And so I found strength in the fact that I am the first in my family to be pursuing a postgraduate degree. I am the first in my family that's going to be, at that point, that was going to be an attorney. And so finding value in that and not minimizing that, I think is really important. And also, if you're at a point where you still have no idea, it's hard for you to envision, your career very far off. You can only imagine things in the very immediate. I think that's fine also. I think just as much as you can have, even if it's for an immediate goal, right? Like, even if it's like, okay, after I graduate, I want to be in this type of space, having that idea is helpful, because then you can think about, who are people that I would want to reach out to? Like, what kind of connections can I make? And that's another thing I would say, is just like, don't be shy. I'm a very shy person. I'm very introverted. And so I find it very difficult to just reach out to people, especially if I see they went to Lehman, to ask for, even like a career advice. How did you end up where you are now? And I think like trying to find comfort in that, especially if you see their alumni and they went to Lehman, people are so gracious and they want to help. I am definitely a resource. So if anybody is interested in going to law school or just talking about careers in general, like, Matt has my information now, but you can definitely reach out to me. And I find that that's the case for most people. They're eager to share information, and just to talk about people, people's path. So that's something to lean in towards.
A follow-up question. Quick aside, I love what you said about the value of coming from a public school background versus a private.
Right.
I used to work in the private sector, and I did notice people who were born with spoons, a silver mouth, so to speak. They weren't skilled at feeding themselves compared to those.
Yes, that's the word. Yes.
So I feel like in the long run, this is the place to be. But that's kind of an aside. My question is, how does the writing, because we're in a professional writing class, how does the writing you studied at Lima compare to the writing you do as a lawyer day to day?
Yeah, so I mean, something, and I think this is a misconception. So the cornerstone, like central to an attorney, is writing. A lot of people have this conception, this idea that, oh, if you're someone that likes to argue with people or debate, or like you're really vocal, then you'll make a great attorney. And that's not necessarily the case. I found that attorneys do more writing usually than anything. And so I just want to say that quickly, especially if you're someone that's shy or introverted, because I was like this. I was like, oh, I can't become an attorney because I'm not someone that's just so eager to always engage in debate or just constantly outspoken. And you will see that in actual practice, those are not often the best skills. Of course, if you become a trial attorney, if you're someone that's confident, really good with public speaking, those are great things. But that not all attorneys do trials, I would say a very small percentage. And then two, there's different types of lawyering. So you can be an attorney if you're interested in the legal field, to be honest. But with that said, at Lehman College, a lot of my writing was, I'm trying to think. So a lot of the writing I did was more academic in nature, usually, or policy based. So especially because I did sociology, so we would have to do a lot of research about a specific issue and then either argue for certain solutions or approaches we would take. So that style of writing has been really helpful in, as a lawyer, because you will find in law school, legal writing is very structured, especially the way they teach it in law school. There's a specific way that you're taught legal writing, and like, how do you distill this argument? How do you break down this argument? How are you compelling to a judge? Because at the end of the day, oftentimes, if you are doing more litigation trial work, your goal is to advocate for someone, your client, and to try to use the law to make the judge agree with the arguments you're making, right? And so you have to have a certain foundation there of being able to argue points, argue certain issues. And I think that's what I learned in college and I was able to translate in law school. But at the same time, law school, it kind of teaches you again how to write in the way they want you to write in terms of the legal world. So if you're someone that has struggled with writing in college, you do kind of learn, you kind of are receive this different orientation as to what is legal writing in law school. So I wouldn't be discouraged by that. And if you're someone that already loves writing, that's really helpful. Even though you will find that like legal writing strips you from a lot of the joy you get from perhaps the type of writing you're doing now. So yeah, so I would say that that's how kind of like the writing I took away from college and then law school and now in my everyday practice.
Any questions here? All right, I have another one on the document. A student asks, any advice for young people of color who may want to go to law school, but are feeling scared or anxious about not getting in?
Yeah, and thank you for that question, because I felt that way before applying to law school. Even in law school, you know how now the very popular term is imposter syndrome. In law school, especially I would say my first year of law school was extremely difficult. And I want to be transparent about that. I struggled with that. And that's something I questioned myself about. And I think it's an unfair burden, especially students of color have to face. Because a lot of students don't go to law school and question their worth, but for some reason, students of color often do. And I would say that kind of you have to kind of push yourself beyond that, because if you don't even give yourself the opportunity to apply, you're never gonna get in. There's no way they're gonna review your application and there's no application in. And I would say the way that you can kind of overcome that fear is talking to attorneys of color, right? Like now you have me as a resource. I can also connect you with other students, well, now attorneys of color that I went to school with and who I didn't go to school with, but they are now attorneys. I think connecting to attorneys of color, they can tell you about their path, their journey, and you will find that more often than not, most people were scared to apply and they did it and they pushed themselves. And so I think talking to attorneys of color, I think having a plan is helpful, right? So just starting to organize like, okay, these are the things I need for law school, learning about the process, because sometimes it's just the fear of the unknown, right? It can feel so overwhelming if you don't know all the pieces that you need for law school. And so if you start to put the pieces together and then you can understand like, okay, so I'm probably gonna have to give myself a year to want to really study for the LSAT, or maybe you're someone that's really good with standardized tests and you're just like, I'm gonna go hard for 6 months and then want to sign up for the test. Making a plan and understanding what are the steps you need to take helps you feel less overwhelmed. And then the other thing I will emphasize is that you deserve to take up space, and please remind yourself of that. I wasn't in school with students who I realized were not any more deserving than me and like students of color. And especially when you're in these classes, you're gonna be capable of having the same conversations. You're gonna be capable of going through the classes. And so just reminding yourself that once you get to that space, you're just as capable. You gotta admit it for a reason. A lot of the reasons why we're not in these spaces is because we stop ourselves very early on. And it's unfair. I'm not saying it's fair that you have that burden, but I think just pushing yourself to overcome it and finding support and community, it's helpful. So you can kind of overcome those fears. So take up the space. You deserve to be in those spaces. We definitely need more attorneys of color. If you look at the demographic of attorneys, it's not very representative of the communities we come from. It's not representative of the demographics even at Lehman, right? Or in these institutions. And it's really important because all these areas of law affect people of color. If you think, especially if you think about the criminal legal field, who are the judges? They're often not who are the judges and the attorneys on both sides, both public defenders and prosecutors. They're not reflective of the people that are being incarcerated. The same way, if you're someone that doesn't want to really do like what we call public interest, so you don't want to do criminal law, you're just interested, you want to make a lot of money, right? And you just want to, I don't know, engage in transaction, what they call transaction, and you like business. So then maybe you're someone that would want to do like corporate law or transactional work. And we need people of color there too. I think if you look at what we call big law firms or big law, these firms often are predominantly do not have the representation of people of color in these firms, and we need more of that. So I would say we're needed in whatever field of law you want to take up space in. But yeah, you deserve to take up the space, and I'm here as a resource. So, and that goes for everybody in this class.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Wondering about your like day to day, like is it mostly client interviews or is it trials, and like how has COVID-19 affected it? because I did a law internship with a
Nice.
family court,
Mm-hmm.
in 2019.
Okay.
So in the courtroom, we were doing trials, but it was mostly like client interviews. I wonder
Right.
how, because of all the restrictions, because of COVID, how that's changed.
Yeah, those are really, really good questions. So in terms of my day-to-day, I would say it's a mix. It's both client, so it is a lot of client communication. So usually though, just to really quickly review the life of a case for the work I do. So I specifically represent individuals that are arrested by immigration custody enforcement, so known as ICE, and then taken to a jail, and they're in those detention centers. So when I pick up a case, I'm part of a program that's funded by the city council. And essentially, it's the idea that they have people in immigration proceedings, deportation proceedings have a public defender, similar as they would have if they were in criminal proceedings. And so when I pick up a case before COVID, it meant going to the jail. So I would go, my first visit with a client would be in person in the jail. And it was very difficult, obviously, because you really seeing someone in conditions where they're confined, and they can't, they have limited access to their family, to their friends. You meet them in really humble conditions, and usually people are at the lowest point of their lives. So it was always very emotionally difficult work, I would say. Since COVID happened, a lot of our initial client meetings, our clients are still in the jails, but we have to do a lot of the video calls through video, which for me, I actually prefer in-person visits because I just feel, just in terms of security, a lot of them don't feel comfortable sharing information because they're often surrounded by other detainees. The correctional officers walk back and forth. There's not that sense of privacy. And when we went in person, we would be put in a room essentially where we had confidential conversations. So that was before, and now after is mostly video conversations. So when I pick up a case, that's the client, the initial client contact. And then I'm always in contact especially if they have family members, we have to get in contact with them, because the first question I have is whether my client is eligible for bond release, meaning like whether there's someone that is eligible to get out. And I don't want to get too technical because it gets confusing, but essentially there's a category of detainees that are eligible to do a bond hearing. And there's a category of detainees that are not eligible, that are under what we call mandatory detention. So because of that, in the beginning, once I figure out if they're eligible for bond, if they are, it's a lot of trying to get in touch with family member, friends, because we essentially have to demonstrate to the judge that this person is not a danger to the community or a flight risk, meaning if they're released, they're still going to come back to court and show up for their court appearances. So that involves a lot of fact gathering. We need letters of support to show, judges love to see that they have community ties. So if they have children, I need to get letters from the partner or the parent of the children. Sometimes we even include letters from the child, depending on how old they are. So that involves a lot of data information collection. And then a lot of my work is also just writing. So I'm either writing motions to the court saying, a motion is when you're asking the court to do something. So you're trying to move them to do something. So sometimes someone's arrested by ICE, and I'm saying that ICE hasn't provided enough evidence proving that this person is removable, is deportable, that they should be in these proceedings. So then we have motions asking the judge to terminate the proceedings. Oftentimes, then as the case moves along, we reach a stage where we either have to have like asylum hearings, some form of hearing where we're presenting a certain claims to the judge as to why this person can't return to the country that they were born in. So that's like a trial. So I would say I usually have trials at least. Right now, my schedule, I'm gonna be having at least one trial each month, with the exception of July, from now to August. So that involves, similar to what you would see in criminal proceedings, we have to do prep with the client. We have to do prep because the Department of Homeland Security in those trials, if we do an asylum hearing, they have the opportunity to cross, meaning they have the opportunity to ask the person questions. So they may ask something like, if someone say they fear going back to Guatemala, the Department of Homeland Security will be like, oh, so what city of Guatemala were you living in? And can't you just move to this other part of Guatemala? So they also ask questions about credibility to see if they're like lying about their fear. So we have to prep with the clients just so they can respond in the best way that they can. And so they sometimes sometimes the questions can be hurtful or just disrespectful, and we have to make sure that our clients know how to respond to those situations. So a lot of trial prep. So yeah, a lot of client communication, writing, a lot of brief writing. Sometimes we have to write briefs about legal issues, and then also just prepping with our clients. So it's a very fast pace. Each day is different depending on like the clients I have, the needs, where I'm at. Like if I'm having a trial next week, then I'm gonna be going really hard, like preparing with one client. And if I have a hearing next month, a trial 2 months down the line, then I'm doing a lot of fact gathering, trying to collect evidence, because the court sets certain deadlines by when we can have evidence before the trial. So it's kind of like a mixed bag of things. But yeah, that's my day to day. Depending on other legal fields, it looks very different. If you're someone that does corporate law, transactional work, that looks more like mediation, meeting with companies. So you're, as a transactional lawyer, a corporate lawyer, you may be working with a firm that's representing Pepsi that wants to unite with another company. And so I would say that's focused more like business, like conversations. It's not an adversarial process. Usually you're not going to court. So some people don't like court. Some people don't want to do trial, and they get more into that field of law. So it's a lot of options when you decide to go to law school.
Thank you.
No problem.
I'm so glad that you are here. Like,
Oh, thank you.
amazing.
Oh, thank you.
A student asked, what are some differences you noticed in your work between the Biden administration and the 45 administration?
Yeah, I love the way you framed that question, first of all. That's a really great question. So I think there are a lot of things that have changed and a lot of things that haven't. So under the previous administration, the sentiment was generally anti-immigrant. And I don't think this is controversial, right? Like, I think this is something that administration, that Trump was very clear about. He was very forthcoming about that. So it had impact even in the smallest of things. Like some of our clients are eligible for what they call work permits, because if someone applies for asylum and they have a pending asylum case, after a certain number of days in court, they're eligible for a work permit, because the idea is that if you came into this country and you're seeking refuge, you should have the right to sustain a livelihood while your case is pending before immigration court, because immigration court cases can take really long, sometimes years. So under the Trump administration, he was trying to do a lot of changes to the work permit. He was trying to make asylum seekers basically have to pay for the work permit, and the way that we have the work permit application. And currently the system we had before him, you didn't have to pay for the initial application. So there was like small changes like that. And then there were bigger changes just in terms of his policy decisions. So under Trump, he said that everybody was a priority for deportation, meaning as long as you were if you did not have lawful status, or if there are a lawful permanent residents. So there are residents that are placed in deportation proceedings. I have a couple of clients like that, and they're placed in deportation proceedings usually because I would say those are most commonly due to some contact they had with the criminal justice system. And so under Trump, basically everybody was prioritized. We found a lot of people being arrested by ICE. And then of course, we know there was a lot of decisions regarding border enforcement. So because he was like, everybody's a priority, that's what led to the separation of families, this rhetoric around building a wall. And I think that also affected the climate of the DHS attorneys. So the Department of Homeland Security attorneys, they work for the government, and in an ideal world, right, they should be somewhat objective, right? Like if they should try to be somewhat cooperative with attorneys that represent the respondents in those cases and see if there's anything they can agree on. And during the Trump administration, and I would say it was largely because of the instructions they were receiving from above, they tended to be more hostile. Cases were much more difficult. And yeah, we saw a lot more arrests. People were in fear. And I think there was also just a lot of people that internalized that language of, you're illegal, you don't belong here. A lot of people started to internalize that. And I think that affected just communities in general. I would say now with the Biden administration, this administration is trying to be a bit more cooperative. they don't have the same rhetoric around like, you know, all immigrants are bad hombres and all that like talk that Trump had. And then there is, for example, under this administration, he brought back something called prosecutorial discretion, which means that if I am an attorney for the government, I represent the Department of Homeland Security, and there is someone that is in removal proceedings, in deportation proceedings, and their attorney reaches out to me and tells me, listen, this person has been here 25 years. They have 2 US citizen kids. They had 0 arrests, or they had 1 arrest because it was during a period that they were affected by mental health issues. Whatever reason, whatever the mitigating circumstances are, as a DHS attorney, I can say, you know what, I think because of the compelling circumstances in these cases, I think we should just terminate these proceedings. Let's take him off these court proceedings. So now we have this thing called prosecutorial discretion, and I was able to achieve that for a client where he's no longer going to be in deportation proceedings because I emphasized the length of time he's been here, the work he does, his family ties, the fact that he doesn't have much family in Mexico. So under the Trump administration, they had no options. They lost that discretion. They really couldn't decide to terminate cases. Now they can. So there's some decisions that are make for a more, I would say, amicable environment for immigrants. With that said, to be transparent with every administration, this is my personal opinion, of course, I feel like there has not been enough done for immigration, and there's still a lot of detention of immigrants, still a lot of ICE arrests. So most organizations are still advocating fiercely for the Biden administration to do more.
Any questions? Why is it so cold in here?
Oh, that still happens? Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
I used to be with like my cardigan. It's intense.
Thank you. Yeah, good call. We shut a window.
Oh, okay.
Yes, Chris?
Another question I had, it's more doing with current events. Thoughts on the appointment process of Judge Jackson trying to be African-American Supreme Court Justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think the nature of the proceedings, how it went down, I think is very reflective of where we're at in terms of the country. Very divisive. I think she's extremely qualified. I think if anybody looked at her record, and honestly, I'm so as someone that works for a public defense office, I'm so happy and grateful that she's someone that served as a federal public defender, because I think that perspective is so important. Oftentimes judges do come from a more prosecutorial background. And I think it does absolutely affect the way they look at cases, the way they even analyze legal issues. And so I'm grateful that she's bringing in her experience as a federal public defender, as someone that was on the sentencing commission, someone that has been a judge at different levels, right? Because also if you're a judge at a trial level versus an appellate level, you are forced to be in a position where you analyze legal issues from a different perspective, because the question that's being asked of you as a judge is very different. And so I think she's extremely qualified. I think the way she engaged, answered the questions was amazing. And she is going back to that question about people of color, she has spoken about, her journey in law school, how she often underestimated herself, both just being a woman and a Black woman specifically, right? And how law school was difficult, how being an attorney, how she's often been doubted, and look at where she's at now. So that goes back to the point of sometimes we really have to remind ourselves that we need to take up this space. And I'm excited. I'm really excited to see what opinions she ends up issuing in the future. And I think she's going to be an amazing Supreme Court justice. Thank you for that question, by the way.
So this week we've been talking about grant writing and fundraising. And this really applies to you, but I would like to ask, have you learned about grant writing along your professional journey?
So I actually did learn about grant writing in law school, because while I was at Penn Law, I participated. There was this recruitment for a program called the nonprofit. It was with Wharton. It was this other school, this business school. And so basically it was focused on nonprofit management and being a part of a nonprofit board. So as part of that program, I ended up getting matched with a nonprofit in Philadelphia, in Philly. And part of my role, after this, so I worked basically close with the executive director in that program, and I decided that I wanted my project to be focused on building a theory of change. So kind of helping the organization refine what their vision is, what kind of actions they wanted to be taken as an organization, and then also to help with the grant writing. So because of that, we learned about grant writing. And that's another thing, like about law school or graduate school in general. Like, even though I went to law school, I really tried to tap into other opportunities, especially because Penn Law is connected with other, they have like the business school, the Wharton School, they have a social policy school. So I tried to not only do, my legal classes, I really wanted to learn about what other opportunities existed. So grant writing, it turned out to be, I think it's a really helpful skill to have, because that's something that's always in demand. If it's something you want to do even as part of your career or, in between careers.
So you were a student editor at the Meridian. Margot Mifflin says hi.
Oh,
Who's the former advisor to the
yes.
Could you talk about your experience as a student journalist?
Yeah, I think I was so eager. I wanted to do more writing on campus and also just get to meet other students. So I think I'm trying to remember. I think they ended up having some event where they were trying to, basically, if you were interested in writing, for the newspaper to come to the meeting, and they spoke more about the role of a student newspaper, especially at college. And I thought it was a really cool mission and purpose that they have. I think storytelling and sharing news and information and facts, even at our college, is really important. I remember when I was at Lima, that's when we had I think it was when they had Hurricane Sandy, if I'm not mistaken. And there were some other events, and they were able to provide coverage of that and talk about how did that affect students. So I've always been someone that's curious about stories and people's stories. So I found that a really good way to get involved. And I learned a lot from, I think journalism is also a specific type of writing and requires a certain type of skill. And I learned about that as a student editor. So I really appreciated my experience with the Meridian.
You've interviewed so many people throughout your career, and I wanted to ask for students who have never really interviewed a stranger, do you have any advice for them? I'm sure it's context specific, but are there general principles of interviewing someone you would recommend?
Yeah, I would say it's important to be transparent as to the purpose, why are you interviewing them, as much as you can be transparent, right? So if you want to put if it's going to be something for a lifestyle, or a specific news story you're working, I think that people feel more comfortable if they have some idea, rather than you're just like, oh, I'm working for this and I just want information from you. I think when people feel that there's a genuine exchange or they're receiving information from you, they're more willing to engage. So I think it's very important to try to be transparent as possible as to what is the purpose of why you want to interview them. I wouldn't say this is not for all context. Depending on the context, sometimes it's helpful to even give heads up as to what kind of questions you'll be asking. But that's more context specific, right? That it depends on what kind of piece you're working on. If it is for a newspaper or something else. Another thing is, like, I know sometimes it's intimidating to speak to a stranger, but remember that they're going to be seeing you in the role once you explain, this is why I'm interviewing you. Oftentimes people do want to share information. If they have agreed at that point to an interview, it's because they're willing to exchange certain information with you. So, try to overcome that initial fear, because if you're both there, that means that they want to engage with you in that conversation. So those are some key advice, some key points I would say that I found helpful, at least.
Fantastic, thank you.
No problem.
In this class, we've been talking about trying to find careers that align with our values. We want to make some money, but we don't want to contribute to causes we don't believe in. How did you settle on your current profession? Do you have any advice for students who are not sure which industry to pursue?
Right. Yeah, that was a tough question for me, especially going to law school, because in the law school I went to, I would say the majority of the population does not end up doing the type of work I'm doing, which we call public interest. which generally is more social justice oriented work. For me, I went into law school knowing that that is why I wanted to get my legal degree. That is why I wanted to be an attorney. I was motivated by, the community I came from, the issues that I saw in my community, and I knew that I realized that getting a legal education is such an enormous privilege, and it's a resource, and it allows me to be in certain spaces. And I wanted to make sure that I used whatever benefits I got from that, whatever access and resources, to bring it back and do good with it. And for me, good was doing more social justice oriented work. So I think, I went to law school having that in mind. With that said, there's significant pay disparities between like what I do and if someone decided to go into corporate law or big law. And I think that's a real question about deciding whether you want to pursue something that would help you get more money or something that you feel matches with your values. In an ideal world, what I try to do is like, I try to find something that would allow me to live comfortably, but I still felt that, I was doing work that allowed me, that confirms with my values. With that said, I would say that, this was like, especially for students of color that ended up going to law school, some of them did go into corporate law or big law, and that it's, they weren't going to be doing like social justice or any work that really correlated with their values, but they probably were the first in their families to be able to make it to that space and be the first in their families to get close to getting a 6-figure salary. And for them, some of their values is just that they want to make sure that, their parents, they don't have the ability to, they don't have retirement funds, for example, for any reasons, their parents may not have access to retirement or to social security benefits in the future. So their main value is that I want to be able to provide for my parents. And I think that's an important value as well. So I think define your values. Try not to be so self-critical. As long as you're not, hopefully not doing work where you're actually harming other people, then I think you can always try to find an appropriate balance. And that's been my take, and that's what I've been driven by so far in my career.
Any more questions in the chat or in room 308? Well, if not, Shabel, thank you so much for visiting us. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did and feels inspired. Did you have any last comments for us?
No, I'm just, thank you for listening to me and for inviting me, Matt. And please feel free to share my email with them. I know also if you had a question and just felt shy, just didn't have the opportunity to ask, you can email me. I'm also happy to talk at any time. So yeah, just reach out to me if there's any way I can help you. I definitely want to be a resource for all of you. So that was my last comment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course. Oh, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Wonderful day. Bye.
Okay, you too. Bye, everyone. Take care.